Welcome back to the Wealth Builder podcast. My name's Nick Donato, and I'm a financial advisor at Guidance Financial. Over the past few weeks, I've received a lot of queries from clients asking if their super is safe. These questions have all been prompted by the recent media reports and ASIC investigations into the First Guardian Master Fund and Shield Master Fund. These two funds are actually managed investment schemes, ultimately investment options, which could be selected on various superannuation platforms, including household names like Macquarie and Netwealth. There are more allegations being thrown around with investigations taking place. There are reports and allegations of mismanagement of investments, with funds supposedly being invested into very speculative investments. There are also allegations that there may have been fraudulent activity, potentially with financial advisors involved as well. There's so much that is yet to be uncovered, with the deputy chair stating that there's been misconduct on an industrial scale here. Superannuation was designed to be a vehicle for everyday Australians to save for their retirement. And in today's episode, we'll discuss how safe your super really is. So on today's episode, we're joined by Paul, your regular host of the Financial Autonomy podcast. Thanks for joining us here today, Paul.
Hey, g'day, Nick. Thanks. Great to jump on. And yeah, this is an important one to discuss, isn't it? So, yeah, looking forward to tossing this one around with you.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for joining. So I guess the big question on a lot of our clients' mind is super safe. And what would you say when someone asks you that question?
Yeah, look, I would certainly say it is, Nick. Now, obviously, as you just touched on there in the intro, there's investigations going on at the minute, and there's these two funds that, there's a lot of questions being asked. But certainly for the research that I've done, and look, I've been in the industry a long time, so there's my memory plus there's ChatGPT. I'm not aware of any super funds ever going bust. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't investment options that get into trouble, and that's what's happened here. And, sometimes investment options that get frozen too. But the regulation around superannuation funds is very strong, as it should be. Everyone relies on it to provide for their retirement. And at least to my knowledge and the research I've found, I don't believe there's ever been a super fund that has actually got into trouble. I mean, have you come across anything different?
No, there's been a few investment options and funds, especially during the GFC, which you'd be familiar with, Paul, that
Yeah.
I am aware of that went frozen or bust or something like that. But no super fund platform providers that I know of have actually gone
No.
belly up.
So on that, and actually probably it might be worth just taking a step back for the listeners. So with this particular issue that's going around at the minute, and it is tricky because it's being investigated. And actually, I should mention we're recording this on the 3rd of September. So depending on when you're listening to this, it's quite possible that there's been more development since. But anyway, we're just talking about what we know at this point. But there's a few different elements here. So as Nick touched on, so there's a couple of funds here, and there's questions around have the managers of those funds been involved in fraud, or is it just a case that they've made some bad investments that haven't worked out? At this point, it's just not clear where that sits. But all the assets in that fund have been frozen, and we might circle back to that. But as you mentioned, Nick, there is precedent for funds being frozen in the past. So there's that element of the investment funds. There's then the element of the super fund administrators, the administrate, sometimes called a RAP, right? And at least as we record this, ASIC has apparently got some charges or investigations on one of those administrators. What they called equity trustees is the one that they've at the minute. So the issue with the administrators is a question around, well, did they do enough due diligence to check that these funds were suitable for their superannuation fund members, right? So there's that question hanging. Uh, and then the third question is there appears to have been two financial planning practices that were the main vehicle through which people ended up into these funds. And, Nick and I have discussed, I mean, prior to this being the media, we'd never even heard of these funds before. And certainly I've not met another financial planner who has either. They're extremely fringe, and the vast majority of financial planners would never touch them because they just don't have the due diligence and research and things that supports them. So it seems like there's just a couple of practices here that have gone down that path. And so there's questions there around, well, were they doing the right thing and following all the regulations? So there's a few different kind of levels to all this. But just on the frozen fund bit, Nick, sorry, I'm waffling a little bit, but I just think that context is useful. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm old enough to have been a financial planner during the GFC in 2008, and it was the case that some funds got frozen then. They were mortgage funds, and by big operators, Challenger, Colonial First State, this sort of stuff. Funds got frozen, and that was an interesting one because basically at the time, that they were mortgage funds, and mortgage funds were a substitute for a term deposit. You got a very similar rate of return, but they're a bit more flexible than a term deposit. And basically, what happened with mortgage funds is investors put their money in, and then the fund manager lent them out, generally in commercial loans for 5 years, 7 years, something like that. In the GFC, of course, people got worried about the financial system. So the government guaranteed initially it was just all bank deposits, and then they had a guarantee of $1 million cap. And today they've brought that down to 250,000. But nevertheless, there was this government guarantee that if your money's in the bank, you're safe, right? But of course, these mortgage funds were outside of that guarantee. And because the returns were essentially the same as a term deposit, a lot of people figured, oh, well, boy, I better take my money out of the mortgage fund where they're not guaranteed and put them into the bank where they are, right? But the problem is, of course, these mortgage funds have lent them out to people paying, and paying them off over 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, whatever the time frame is. And the mortgage funds just can't say, well, bad luck, person, we've lent you money, you're going to have to pay it back tomorrow. That's not how it works. So the mortgage funds couldn't instantly give everyone back their money. And so what happened is the funds got frozen so that then, everyone got treated fairly, basically, that the loans were able to just run off in due course and people got their money. And to my knowledge, like everyone did get their money, but they just had to be patient, right? So there is, the optimist in me is that maybe this current situation will play out similarly, right? ASIC's frozen all the funds. By all accounts, there's some, unusual investments in these funds, but perhaps that just means that they take a while to be sold and eventually they will be sold. And it would seem improbable unless there's major fraud here, and we just don't know if that's true. It would be improbable that investors are going to get zero, right? That there would seem to be, one would hope, there's investments here apparently. It's but they've been frozen so that they can be sold in an orderly way and maximize the value for investors. Is that, because you've done more reading on this than me, Nick, but is that your understanding of it?
Yeah, there's a lot. Again, they're all allegations at the moment, with everything going through ASIC, who's the watchdog, so to speak, at the moment. But yeah, there's funds there that have to be somewhere, and you know, if there was fraudulent activity, we don't know, and there might be less than what there should be. But at the end of the day, it's all speculation at the moment, and in the
Mm.
next couple of weeks, even before this podcast comes out, I'm sure there'll be even more news surrounding the issue. But
Mm.
I guess it's just a wait and see. But me and you, Paul, we've been getting the question from our clients around the safety of super, and I guess that's why today I wanted to raise that and discuss that because you know people are concerned about their own super savings.
Mm.
And people are building these for retirement, and one day they want to, give up work and be able to do whatever they want to do, go on holidays or whatnot. And there's something that's happened like this is pretty shocking when people have 100% of their savings in this one investment that goes frozen. is recoverable, isn't recoverable. So it's a big shock to the system.
Yeah, totally. And especially, I mean, we all put money in super. We don't even get a choice, right? I mean, you have to put 12% in. So like, it's absolutely crucial that we as Australians have confidence in our superannuation system. And so that's obviously why ASIC's gone in and frozen assets and, it's taking all sorts of action to protect people's money. And, let's hope that that plays out well. Did you? Yeah, I think you were going to.
So
You might have
yeah, I
already touched on
guess
ASIC's role. Did you? Have we spoken about that much?
no, I guess we should touch on ASIC's role and just explain who they are and what they do when it comes to super. So ASIC is ultimately the regulator or the watchdog, so to speak, just to make sure that uh, super funds and advisors are acting efficiently, honestly, and fairly towards clients and consumers out there. They do have, law enforcement powers and actions that they can take if there's breaches of laws like the Corporation Act, the Superannuation Act. So they do have some power, and as I said, they're the regulator, and that's why they're taking the steps to investigate this particular incident that's occurred, and they're the regulator that would, take care of people if something happened with their own super funds.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, super funds have all sorts of requirements to be registered and, audit requirements and those sort of things. And as do financial advisors for that matter, as do investment funds as well. So, yeah, there's lots of different opportunities for ASIC to get involved at all the different levels, I suppose. And yeah, it would seem that they're diving in there with full force at the moment, which is exactly what we want them to be doing, right? So, yeah, it's certainly a key element of us all having a bit of confidence in the system.
Yeah, and it goes beyond that. They've got, disclosure oversight so they can monitor
Mm,
the accuracy and the information is, true and proper. So it goes beyond the when a big incident happens, they're there, but they should be also have a bit of a disclosure oversight to make sure that, as we chug along and things are moving and there's nothing too untoward happening out there in society, that they're still there watching, making sure that everyone's in line, so to speak.
exactly right. Um, compensation schemes, Nick. I mean, that's something that I guess crops up a little bit. Do you want to take us through what's the situation on that front?
Yeah, I guess this goes back to, I guess, the incident at hand, that if there's something untoward that has happened, there's no universal compensation scheme if a super fund was to go bankrupt. So again, in this incident, those two funds actually managed investments, so it's slightly different. There is, on the other hand, a compensation scheme called Compensation Scheme of Last Resort, and we love an acronym, so it's CSLR. Um, and what that scheme is, that's for someone who has received financial advice, and financial advice that has misled a consumer, a client, a person, and they can get access to up to $150,000 worth of compensation if they've been misled. So that is one scheme out there that, you know, people can look at. Hopefully, not many people have to look at it because that means they've been misled by an advisor,
Mm,
but that
mm.
is a scheme available to investigate.
Yeah, so on that, I mean, all financial planning businesses or their licensee um, needs to hold professional indemnity insurance, right? So if something goes wrong in the first instance, um, that's where people would look, right? Um, But the compensation scheme of last resort is to deal with the fact that sometimes what happens, if it has happened in the past, Dixon Advisory is the big one that gets talked about a lot. Um, they had so many instances they'd given poor advice around self-managed super, and they had so many instances that they just put the whole business into liquidation, and basically they didn't have enough money to pay compensation to people that they needed to. Um, and so the compensation scheme of last resort, basically all financial planners contribute into that pool. And it just ensures that if someone's lost money as a consequence of a financial advisor doing something wrong, then basically we all kind of chip in to do our best to make things right. And I know for our licensee, because I'm involved in running that, I think we chipped in about $5,000. It's sort of done on a per advisor basis, and it depends how many clients you look after. But yeah, all advisors chip into that scheme anyway, just as an extra, consumer protection item. So obviously, if you've got into, some sort of financial issue direct, you haven't gone through an advisor, then you don't have access to that. This is only for people that obtained advice, but it is just an extra bit of consumer protection that does exist, and it's good that it does exist, right? So, yeah, some extra elements there.
But in this situation, where we're chatting about frozen funds and illiquid funds, I guess it's more of a investment conversation around investment risk and making sure you've got your investment allocation aligned correctly to your objectives as a person and as a client. Um,
Mm.
Outside of the super fund being safe, it comes down to, are the investments safe, so to speak, or do they align to your risk tolerance? Because when it comes to investing, whether you're buying a managed fund or a Aussie share or a term deposit, there's always a level of risk involved.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point for us to dig into because as we touched on already, as much as the media hasn't necessarily made that clear, there hasn't been a super fund go bust here. The super funds are fine, right? The issue is that within the fund, people have chosen or been directed to a couple of investment options that have got themselves in strife, right? So, um, yeah, there's issues there around, investment options, as you say, level of risk. And in fact, my understanding is that the only sort of, I don't know, live charges or whatever's going on at the minute in terms of ASIC and equity trustees, the allegations there, it's around the fact that equity trustees let people put like 95 or 100% of their super into one fund option, which is really unusual. Typically, and we strike this all the time, for say for ETFs that a lot of listeners would be familiar with, most of the super funds won't let you put more than 10% into a single ETF, right? And an ETF might have 1,000 different shares sitting underneath it, but nevertheless, that's just kind of standard risk management practice, right? You don't put all your money into a single investment option in these type of structures. Um, Now, I mean, that it does look different. If you're in a regular industry fund or something like that, you probably do have everything in the balance fund or the high growth fund. And that's fine because that's quite a different structure. You've got the super trustee actually keeping an eye over that, and they're naturally diversified anyway. So please don't take this to suggest that if you're in one of those mainstream funds, all of a sudden you've got to cut it up across a whole lot of different options. That's not what we're saying at all. But if you're in um, an administration, a wrap type super fund, um, depending on the investment that you're in, and that's where these products, there is a bit of complexity to them. But if you're picking sort of individual fund managers and things, then typically you would spread it around. I guess a caveat to that, maybe where you wouldn't, and we use these type of ones, is where you're predominantly using index options. If you're using mainstream index options, there's less need to spread it around because if you're going in the index, let's say you're going in the ASX 200 index, well, if you're using the mainstream players, I mean, you could split it around, but you're getting exactly the same portfolio with each person because they're just with each provider because they're just copying the index, right? So, um, yeah, so it's it's a subset of a subset of a subset, right? It's where you're doing your super, where you're having probably active funds management, you're spreading it around, you're trying to kind of be aggressive and chase some higher returns. Um, you wouldn't typically be putting it all into one fund, and that seems to be where a large part of the problem has arisen here. What have I missed there, Nick?
No, that's you're on the money there. Around diversification being, I guess, a great, depending on every individual circumstances and how they're set up. Diversification is definitely a great tool to mitigate risk or minimize risk. Obviously, you can go too far and have way too many assets, so to speak, within a portfolio, and then the diversification loses some of its benefits. But that's a big tool that we use as financial advisors, that people use out in their own personal portfolios as a tool. Again, very common saying, don't put all the eggs in the one basket.
Mm.
So it's yeah, a big tool to use.
It is hard in super though, isn't it? Because the reality is, well, we're generally encouraged to consolidate our supers. It's the most fee efficient, right? So, yeah, it's a tricky one, and as I say, it's sort of just unique to the structure that these ones have had, which is not how most people invest their super. It's probably also worth mentioning too that um, superannuation investments, they do go up and down, right? I mean, invested in shares and property and that sort of stuff, and the values on those go up and down. Even interest rates on cash savings and bonds move, right? So there's a degree to which, like, the purpose of today's podcast is talking about, is your superannuation safe? And we can certainly say that, look, the superannuation systems in Australia is extraordinarily safe. But of course, you're taking on investment risk, and some people are more aggressive than others, and your intention in taking on that risk is to try and generate a higher return. But of course, the more aggressive you are, the more risk you take. Well, sometimes things don't work out, and it's not clear yet in terms of these particular problems. But you know, perhaps it's just that they have been made some quite aggressive investment decisions that haven't worked out, and that does happen from time to time. And um, that's where it's important as the investor to just, I guess, try and understand what it is you're investing in. And if you're not clear on what you're investing in, then maybe, find an alternative investment where you are clear, because you do need to have an appreciation for what's, where your money's going, I suppose.
Yeah, 100%. And there's various different risks when you learn about investment markets and whatnot. There's heaps of different risks that you can chat about and delve into, some more relevant than others. In this instance, or in frozen funds instances, I guess liquidity risk is one that comes out a lot, which is the possibility that the fund cannot meet its short-term financial obligations. Again, with speculative investments, there's a potential that that was a large risk, or that could be a large risk, with not being able to get your money, as you said, off the top in those mortgage funds. There was a pretty good liquidity risk in there as the market crashed at the GFC and everyone wanted their money out.
Mm.
Um, there's market risk, which is, the possibility that people's retirement savings, investments lose value. And we see that every day in the market as it ebbs and flows through announcements, change of political regimes. Um, there's various things that affect the market, and that can affect your superannuation, your personal investments, your bank account, even. So, with these allegations, there's been some talks about what financial advisors have done, and some potentially not doing the right thing by their clients. They're all allegations, obviously. As advisors ourselves, it's a bit of the elephant in the room. It's a tough conversation for us to have, but one that we should have with clients and our audience, around trust, and if an everyday Australian can trust an advisor. What would you say to someone that asked you straight out, Paul, can I trust you as my advisor?
Yeah, Nick, well, as you say, Nick, look, it is uncomfortable because it does feel, appear from the information so far that at least a piece of the puzzle in terms of what's gone wrong in the instance that's floating around at the minute is there's a couple of advisory practices that have seemingly done the wrong thing. I mean, we'll have to wait and see what once ASIC does all their investigations, but um, let's not ignore that, right? So, yeah. So, in terms of people's trust in financial advisors, I guess the things to know are that I don't know exactly the financial advisor numbers in Australia. But I don't know if you do, Nick, but certainly it's in the thousands, and as I'm sure it would be the case in any profession, accountants, teachers, police officers, anything you like, that if you've got enough, there's going to be one or two bad eggs. And there's a lot of steps to try and weed that out, but weeding out every single one is very difficult, right? So that has to be acknowledged. There is a lot of regulatory oversight, though, in terms of financial advisors. So, as an advisor, you do need to be registered with ASIC, and there's a register that online that everyone can log into, and it sort of validates that every advisor is licensed. They've got a particular registration number, and that also tracks their history. So if there's been complaints and these sort of things, it shows up on the register. So there is, consumers can first of all check that someone who says they're an advisor actually is a licensed advisor. The other element in terms of being a licensed advisor is there's quite a few hurdles, I suppose, that someone needs to do or complete to be on that register in the first place. So things like there's a competency exam that's required. In most instances, there's a requirement to have an appropriate degree. Um, there's ongoing professional development points that a financial advisor has to maintain. A lot of professions have that as well. There's also oversight from the licensee, which is the entity that's directly responsible to ASIC. So, for instance, we have file audits every year, where an external auditor reviews files to make sure that we're doing everything appropriately. So there are quite a lot of checks and balances. Or yeah, there's a good system in place to ensure that financial planners are doing the right thing. And yeah, so it's really, frankly, it's a bit disheartening as a financial planner when there is something like this where it seems, uh, it, it, yeah, again, there's lots more to come, but it doesn't seem like the financial advisors here are the main problem, but nevertheless, they've been an enabler to some extent, it would appear, and yeah, it's certainly disappointing.
Just to build on the requirements that new financial advisors have to go through to jump onto to get onto that register. I guess a lot of changes happened out of the Royal Commission. That happened a fair few years ago now. And I guess I'm one of the advisors or one of the people who became an advisor after those requirements came through. And they are stringent in the sense that we have to do, it's basically an apprenticeship. It's called a professional year that never takes 12 months. It's always 18 months to 2 years. And there's, a lot of checks that you have to do to get yourself through that, recording hours, have a senior person sit over your shoulder to make sure everything's you're doing is correct and by the book, and ultimately at the end of the day in the best interest of the clients that you're helping. So there is a lot of steps that you have to take to get here and be an advisor. Um, there's a bit involved.
Mm, mm. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Nick. Um, so, look, in terms of, I guess, listeners want to know that their money's safe, right? Um, you know, what can people be doing to protect their money, I suppose? We sort of touched on a few, but maybe do you want to kind of try and sum it up a bit?
Yeah, so check that ASIC register. when you go on to see someone to make sure that they're on there. I guess that's your first point of call, as you've already stated, Paul. Um, then there's a bit of common sense to say it could sound too good to be true. If someone's offering you an investment that's going to give you a 20% guaranteed return, that sounds too good to be true to me. So it's a bit of a sniff test, so to speak, when you're chatting to anyone. Um, then there's also the piece around, as we chatted about when it comes to investment, making sure the fund you're in is potentially diversified depending upon, again, the product and where you are. So there's a bit involved. And at the end of the day, it would be a suggestion to go and get some financial advice if you have any concerns or just trying to help
Mm.
you achieve your goals and you want someone to help you explain, give you the peace of mind and eliminate some worries to put together a strategy to help you get to where you want to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you mentioned there about sounds good to be true, Nick, which I think is a really good one. And certainly some of the media coverage that I've read on this most recent issue was apparently there was some I don't know if it was aggressive marketing, but in any event, sort of marketing that was, well, your super fund's not doing good enough and you should move over here because you can get better returns, right? And so it's playing on our natural sort of greed motivator, which is sometimes that would be portrayed as a negative, but that's not what I'm trying to say, right? It's actually for humans, it's part of our survival instinct and that, right? But so we've got to kind of fight against that. That actually, well, generally when we do modeling, we assume super's going to earn 8%, right? And if you look at all the big funds and what their normal sort of balance type fund has done, somewhere around 8%, right? But we certainly get sometimes people come in and they've got funds that have done perfectly reasonable returns and they're, oh, no, it's not earning enough. I could have done better than that. Uh, you know, uh, well, you're just asking for trouble. Like, if you're chasing higher returns, well, the only way that can happen, absent of like fraudulent type stuff, but is taking extra risk. And like, there's no free lunch, right? The higher returns don't come just because you're a nice person and you deserve it, right? So yeah, I guess just yeah, that too good to be true is definitely a key element of it, and just sort of recognize that being greedy is not a smart approach, right? Be satisfied with a reasonable return. It's going to bob around one year to the next. That's normal kind of stuff. But a reasonable long-term average, and don't sort of feel like you need to take on crazy risks and yeah, try and squeeze out the last extra 0.5% or something, because maybe the risk you're taking on to do that far outweighs the little bit of extra return that you're getting.
Yeah, everyone, I guess it's human nature that we want a better return, a bit more. Um, but yeah, sometimes it is too good to be true. That's not saying that you don't get real high investment returns. It's in year to year coming out of the COVID year, there was markets were flying. But the years before they weren't going too well, but yeah, if there's someone guaranteeing a return, then you might want to start asking some questions.
Yeah, that's definitely a red flag, isn't it? Well, Nick, I mean, where do we want to? I mean, I think we should bring this one into land again, and hopefully we've answered this enough. But in terms of the episode title, and is your super safe? We're certainly here to say that it is. The superannuation system in Australia, I mean, it's so central to our whole financial system, isn't it? I mean, everyone has to contribute whether they like it or not, and therefore it's got a heck of a lot of government oversight. The regulators, the cop on the beat, ASIC in this instance, has certainly been right on it. So super is safe. The problem here seems primarily to be a couple of investment options, which are actually pretty fringe. I mean, certainly in our business, certainly for regular clients listening, index at the core is our approach. And the index providers that we use are all the mainstream providers that everyone would be familiar with. So yeah, the system's fine. In terms of superannuation, in terms of investment managers, the overwhelming majority of those are fine as well. It just seems to be a couple of unusual kind of small boutique fringe kind of operators here that have caused the issue. And the advice system is very highly regulated, and there's quite a lot of protections there as well. Anything to add there, Nick, before we say farewell?
No, I'd say that's a wrap on today's episode. Thanks for joining me today. I know that there was a couple of curly questions in there around whether we can trust advisors and whatnot, but hopefully we've given the audience a bit more information and a bit more education around super and how safe it is. Um, Thanks to everyone for listening along as well. If you liked the episode, feel free to leave us a review or share it with someone you know who might want to hear what we've chatted about today. And we look forward to bringing you the next episode in a fortnight time. But until then, have a great day.